Genesis chapter 49 and verse 14. Issachar is a strong ass, couching down between two burdens. And he saw that rest was good, and the land that it was pleasant, and bowed his shoulder to bear, and became a servant unto tribute. Shalom, brothers and sisters. This is your brother Hawaii. Want to give all praise and glory to our Heavenly Father, Yahweh, in the name of our Lord and Savior, Yahawashi. Grace and mercy and blessings be abound to the hopeful elect scattered throughout the four corners of the earth that are waiting on the second coming of our Lord and Savior, Yahawashi HaMashiach, who will destroy the nations with the rod and iron according to the will of the Heavenly Father, as spoken of by the prophets, that the star shall come out of Jacob and shall smite the children of Edom and Moab, and the children of Ammon shall obey. As we know, we are in the last days, and we want to continue to give our people the faith that comes out from the scriptures. And it's very important that brothers that are, scattered throughout the four corners of the earth understand the end time prophecies and the signs that were given, that we may be able to know that we're in the last days. And this is even works for anybody that is not even of the tribe of Issachar. And the reason why we say that is because even if you're in another part of the world, but you're able to understand these particular prophecies of what's going on when you're with your brethren over here, or what happened with them, it's still a sign of, the manifestation of the Lord's word. And it's also something that's also a good faith booster for, not only the brothers that are descendants of those that had settled in what is now known as Mexico, but it's also for the brothers as well that believe on the scriptures according to the prophecies that we would believe in the last days. And in order for you to know that you're in the last days, there are certain prophecies that have to be understood. And a lot of people that, deny some of these scriptures and some of the prophecies, it's because they don't have the Lord with them for them to understand. And you would, in order to have the testimony of Yahawashi, it says you're going to have to also have what's the spirit of prophecy, because everything in the scriptures concerning Yahawashi is basically manifest in these words, including, the outcome of various prophecies. Okay, because in these days that we're in, it's important that we are able to have an understanding of what's really going on step by step. If somebody basically has a good word of prophecy and it comes to pass, that is something that's supposed to be able to boost our faith and our trust in the Lord's word. Because if we able to go into these scriptures and see the word of the Lord manifest, and we're in the end times, we should be able to believe that his words concerning our deliverance will manifest as well. So this is going to be a brief lesson, but I'm going to basically attach a video at the end of this lesson that's going to basically go over, what we're talking about in terms of prophecy. But let me go ahead and go up to our forefather Jacob, who prophesied the last days to, his sons and what would happen to them. So this is Genesis chapter 49 and verse 1. And Jacob called unto his sons and said, Gather yourselves together, that I may tell you that which shall befall you in the last days. Gather yourselves together and hear, ye sons of Jacob, and hearken unto Israel your father. Okay, so we are to hearken unto Israel, our father. Okay, he spoke this prophecy as he was moved to speak on it, which we know that our forefather Jacob, whose name became Israel, was not only, our forefather according to the flesh, but he was also a prophet according to the spirit, meaning that he had the spirit of the Most High upon him to prophesy these things that would happen thousands of years later. So this is not just for you, for you to understand, okay, Judah's prophecy, it's also for you to understand your brethren's prophecies. And we have too many people that, push this Negro only doctrine. And it's amazing how all these Negro only people claim to be usually of the tribe of Judah, but they don't care about what's going on with the other tribes, right? And that sends to the ego of our people, who are not really worried about the gathering of our people in these last days. And then they're short-sighted on basically the prophecies that are written, because really they have not yet fully believed on Yahawashi HaMashiach, and the Most High has blinded some of them from understanding. So really this lesson is for those that would hear and understand, and hopefully be edified in these times. So we're going to go back down to Issachar's prophecy. And it says, Issachar is a strong ass, couching down between two burdens. And he saw that rest was good, and the land that it was pleasant, and bowed his shoulder to bear, and became a servant unto tribute. Okay, so there's many things in these two verses that can be broken down, but we're going to really just deal for now with this became a servant unto tribute. Okay, because this particular prophecy is a very unique prophecy in regards to the tribe of Issachar. Okay, and when we go into it, we're just going to go into the word for servant first, all right, which is abad. Okay, so abad is a servant or made a slave. Okay, so it says to serve, okay, to till, to servant, work, worshiper, service, dress, labor. Okay, now, by the way, the name Issachar means he is hired. Okay, Issachar. Okay, means he is hired. So in the last days, his name will be made manifest. What a lot of people understand is that the names that was given to us primarily really by our foremothers, because I believe the only son that was named by the father was Benjamin. Okay, Benjamin was actually named by Jacob, Bunyamyam, son of the right. But the other sons were named by the mothers. Okay, primarily, you know, of course, the two mothers. You had, of course, the other concubine wives of Jacob as well, that also gave birth to the tribes, to their own, according to their own respective sons that they gave birth to. But what we do understand is that when you look at the names of the tribes, they fit end time prophecy. And when you go through each one, you have to signify what is the last days. And if a particular time period is known as the last days, when did it start, based off of when you think it is? And when you look at each particular group of people, what happened to each particular group of people, and how can you signify that this is that particular person? Now, we go into this being gave a servant unto tribute, as we know, in the end days, when the Edomites rose to power, they were to put our people into captivity. Now, our people were scattered throughout the four corners of the earth, but something in particular happened with the tribe of Issachar, okay, which we'll go into. So, as we go on, it says serve. So you see here, and it says to labor, work, to do work, to work for another. Okay, that's key. Serve another by labor. Serve as subjects. Now, what we're going to do, we're going to go ahead and go into tribute, right? So they became servants unto tribute, and that word there for tribute is a gang or body of forced laborers, task workers, labor band, gang, forced to work, task, work, serfdom, tributary, tribute, levy, taskmasters, discomfited. Now, if you know anything about what's going on in Babylon, there's, for one, we have what's going on now, and we have what's happened in the past with Issachar. I'm going to deal with what's happened in the past Issachar, which was what we're going to get into in terms of the video and this particular lesson. But I'm going to point to what's going on in today's time. When you read these particular words, we have brothers, okay, that work with Issachar out doing construction. And do you know what they are called? Do you know what those Issacharites, okay, when you go around the country and they're being picked up to do these different tasks, they're called day laborers. Okay? They're called day laborers. They are the ones hired. He is hired for labor. So even in these last days of the last days, they still fit that particular prophecy. The other tribes don't even fit that prophecy. Not that there's not other tribes that are day laborers, but we know that the overwhelming majority, and talk to any brother that has worked as a day laborer, who's worked on construction sites around the country, they're going to tell you the same thing. It's the same set of people that you see fulfilling this particular prophecy. But the thing about it is, the end of it is not yet. Okay, so when you go into the tribute thing, as we go on, we're going to go into something that happened. Now, this right here is regarding to what's known as Mexican slavery. Okay, this particular video will be at the end. I will have it linked up at the end, where this host talked about the history. Now, these guys have really studied the history of what happened in Mexico, all right, to the native people, okay, not the Spaniards that settled there, but what the Spaniards that settled there did to the natives of those people. And what they did is something called the encomienda, okay. Now, the encomienda was a Spanish policy. Now, it says here, encomienda in Spain's American and Philippine colonies, legal system by which the Spanish crown attempted to define the status of the indigenous population. Okay, that's very key. It was based upon the practice of exacting tribute from Muslim and Jews during the Reconquista of Muslim Spain. So the original setting of this happened during the time of the Reconquista. Now, remember the word that says tribute, okay? Remember that. It says exacting tribute. It tells you that Issachar was given as a servant to tribute. Now, you're going to see what's going to happen as we keep going on. It says, although the original intent of the encomienda was to reduce the abuses of forced labor employed shortly after the Europeans' 15th century discovery of the New World, in practice it became a form of enslavement. That's the reason why you see there it says Mexican slavery, because that's what it was. The natives, the Aztecs, okay, and the people groups that were related to them were put under this encomienda, which was a form of tribute and a form of enslavement. It was basically the same thing, and you're going to learn about it as you listen to the last part of this lesson, which will basically be the whole video concerning what happened during those times. Okay, and for many people that have this mentality of not caring about what happened to the indigenous people, you're going to have to ask yourself whether or not you feel like you would have been any better if your ancestors, your brethren that were of the southern tribes, if they would have been better off if they faced what the natives of Mexico faced, the Aztecs and their other basically family groups that were related to them, because there were some other ones that broke off that were a part of that same group, and there were splinterings that happened leading up to the time of the Spanish coming there. Now, as you go on, it says, as legally defined in 1503, an encomienda, from Spanish encomendar, to entrust, consisted of a grant by the crown to a conquistador, a soldier, or an official or other of a specified number of Indios, Native Americans, and later Filipinos living in the particular area, meaning in Native Americans, meaning native of the Americas, okay, particularly the ones that we're talking about in Mexico, okay. Now, Filipinos also went through this same thing too, the natives of the Philippines. That's the reason why a lot of our people have no idea why were the Spanish doing this particular thing in the Pacific islands of the Philippines, and doing this among the natives of the Americas in their Spanish colonies, because they even understand who those people were. And we have a lot of brothers and sisters that believe on the name of Yahawashi Hamashiach out in the Philippines. Okay, that's a whole nother subject in and of itself. Now, as we go on, it says the receiver of the grant, the encomiendero, could exact tribute. Remember that word tribute. That's in the prophecies. That's why it's so beautiful that when the word was translated, the word there was translated to being tribute. Okay? So like when you go there, the word there is mak. Okay? Tribute. So it says here, could exact tribute from the Indios in gold, in kind or in labor, and was required to protect them and instruct them in the Christian faith, The encomienda did not include a grant of land, but in practice the encomienderos gained control of lands inhabited by indios and failed to fulfill their obligations to the indigenous population. To the Crown attempt to end the severe abuses of the system with the law of Burgos from 1512 to 1513 and the new law of the Indies 1542 failed in the face of colonial opposition. In fact, a revised form of the repartimiento system was revived after 1550. It says the encomienda was designed to meet the needs of the American colonies' early mining economy. With the catastrophic decline in the Indian population and the replacement of mining activities by agriculture in Spanish America, the system lost its effectiveness and was gradually replaced by the hacienda system of land estates. Although the encomienda was not officially abolished until the late 18th century. So that gives you an idea how long their slavery was. Just about as long as the chattel slavery, right, of the so-called black, or what they called Negro, all right, the misnomer, the byword, here in North America. So this is what we have to understand about what they went through as well. And stop being so insensitive to the plight of what happened to your brethren. You know, we have to have an understanding of this, because the Most High cares if you don't care. And if you don't care, then you're not of the Most High. So it says in September 1721, the conferment of the new encomiendas in Spain's colonies was prohibited. Okay? And the encomienda, when you go into it, one of the more examples of it was basically in Mexico, which we'll get into. Okay, so this particular one, I was just giving a brief overview of what an encomienda is, rather than the exact what happened in Mexico, so to speak, because you're going to watch that in the video or in the audio of how they basically break down how the system worked in Mexico in particular. Now, also, we're going to go into this. Now, this is one of the things I also wanted to always show the brethren. We've probably seen us bring this on the block. This is concerning a quote that was in the book, okay, called The Origins of the American Indians by Lee Huddleston. Now, Lee Huddleston was a person who composed many of the writings of the early explorers and put them in a book to give the history of what their contact with the natives of the Americas. Now, in one of these pages, in page 88, as you see here, it says the Mexicans are originally of the 10 tribes captured by Salmanasar and of the family of Issachar. And you can read about Salmanasar, you know, in the Book of Kings, the taking down of the northern tribes, the captivity, then also the release of them. About in 2nd Ezra chapter 13, you can read about how they came over to this other land. Okay, so this proves that the explorers knew that this is what they were told. Okay, and it says, and of the family of Issachar, whom the Indians recognized as their special ancestor. So the natives of Mexico said that Issachar was their special ancestor, because every tribe has a special ancestor that goes back to the sons of Jacob. And when you go to Genesis 49, each one of those tribes were supposed to go through a specific set of things. And that therefore makes that particular man, all right, the patriarch, your special ancestor that derives from Jacob. So they knew this. They knew this. They knew who they were. There were those of our people that still knew who their forefather was. And that's one of the reasons why when the explorers went around, when they asked them, where did y'all come from? How did y'all get here? They had that story passed down in oral tradition throughout the Americas, that they came from another land. And when the explorers came here and they looked at the artifacts, they noticed that there was very similarities to the same type of things that you would see in the Middle East as far as the artifacts. They found tablets written in Hebrew with the commandments on it, okay, in like Los Lunas, New Mexico. They found Assyrian coins. They found things, artifacts that would be dated and go back to the Middle East, where they came from, their ancestors came from. So we have to understand that this stuff is here for a reason, okay? Now, I'm going to show you the book, because actually I bought this book back in, November 1st, 2017. Okay, we brought it on the block at one point. I forgot which video it was on, but this is the book. It's called The Origins of the American Indians, European Concepts from 1492 to 1729. And the cover looks exactly like this in paperback, the one that I have. And basically it tells you here, it says the American Indian origin, okay, which we just gave you the origin of the natives of Mexico, primarily would be the Aztecas. Culture and language engaged the minds of Europe from 1492, which is when Columbus came here, to 1729. Were the Indians a result of a co-creation where they descended from the 10 tribes of Israel? This is on Amazon. And we just proved it based on that statement that they understood that they were. And you got people out here saying that they're not. So let me guess, they went back in time to tell a lie that you say we're telling, that many of us are, you accuse us of saying today, that the natives of Mexico were the descendants of Issachar. They wrote that in a letter. They wrote that in a letter of when they talked with the natives hundreds of years ago. And then y'all are saying that today we're saying that because we're just trying to grab them into the fold of Israel. That doesn't make any sense. Go to states like Oaxaca, okay, where you'll find the indigenous people that were remaining among the people. Some of them scattered and went to other places and mingled among the other, the settlers that came from Europe. But when you go to Oaxaca, you'll see the people that were isolated from the rest of the population. Okay, and we'll talk about other groups that are there as well. Because there's always a little bit of confusion about who is there. I believe they even bring it up slightly, if you listen carefully, about another group of people that were later brought to Mexico, okay, and why they were brought and what they did, okay. And so you have to understand is that our people were going to be brought together to be oppressed together, okay, and we have to have a good understanding of that. So I'm gonna go ahead and cap it off before y'all watch the rest of this. This is Job chapter 8 and verse 8. For inquire, I pray thee, of the former age, and prepare thyself to the search of their fathers. Okay, that's is what we're doing. We're preparing ourselves for the search of our fathers, the former age, the former times. For we are but of yesterday and know nothing. Because, we are a manifestation of the things that were from yesterday. And know nothing. A lot of times our people don't even pass on history. That's why so many of our people are lost, because there's a lack of knowledge among our people. We got people, it's 2020, right? And we got people still calling themselves black. Think about that. After all this information that's out here, you got people that don't understand it because so many of our stuff was beaten out of us, or we were forced not to teach it. And then even among our people, even when you teach it, you got so many of our people that want to suppress that information. They want to reject it, and they want to keep you in darkness because they don't got the spirit of the Lord on them, and they have the spirit of Satan. They have that mentality of like wanting to be, they relish in the darkness and the despair and the hopelessness of our people. So they want you to stay there. But those of our people that want to be enlightened, this is for you. Because our days upon earth are a shadow. Shall not they teach thee and tell thee and utter words out of their heart? So what we just read, they uttered words out of their heart. They taught us. When we went into the search of our fathers, this is what they said. The Mexicans are originally of the 10 tribes captured by Salmanasar, and of the family of Issachar, whom the Indians recognize as their special ancestor. So these Edomites, man, when they came here, they knew who they were jacking up. That's the reason why they went so hard body, man. That's why their atrocities were so ferocious upon our people in particular, even compared to the other places that they conquered. When they came here and they found out that this is the part of the 10 tribes of Israel, their hatred fully made manifest. And that's the reason why they're going to go down. And the awakening is not going to be stopped, because this was prophesied to come to pass. As our forefather Jacob said, come and hear what will befall you in the last days. And we are in the last days, and we're understanding that prophecy. So hopefully this is edifying. And again, I want to give all praise and glory to Yahweh Ba'Shem, Yahweh Shai. Peace, mercy, and blessings be abound to the hopeful elect. Shalom.
You do very interesting work. So I want to get to the Mexican slavery piece, because I don't think in North America we think of slavery beyond much about what we did or what happened in the islands before liberation, and yet there's a sadness to the story in Mexico that's just as profound as ours.
Oh yeah, well, there's a curious difference between the two slaveries, that the two systems of slavery. The Spaniards, when Cortez conquered Mexico, they had a very hip attitude toward slavery, that they didn't buy slaves from Africa or anything. They would just enslave the native population. They even did that in Europe when they conquered a European country. And so when they conquered Mexico, there were over 30 million indigenous people living in Mexico, and a lot of them, they killed a lot of the Spaniards killed a lot of them inadvertently through the diseases, smallpox, measles, right, whatever. But they also in 1565, the Spaniards had a silver strike called El Rufo, and they discovered almost overnight that Mexico was one gigantic mountain of silver. And as soon as they discovered that, the days were numbered for the native population, and they just enslaved them. They had no rights. They just enslaved them promiscuously into the silver mines, the gold mines, in the different haciendas, and worked them to death in the fields. And within about less than 100 years from that moment, they had reduced the indigenous population from over 30 million down to less than 1 million, and they were in the process of going extinct. And the Catholic Church, which had been relatively cruel in their attitude toward colonization, they actually intervened. And they said, these people that, we may not think much of them, but they've got souls to be saved for Jesus. Therefore, there was no penalty for killing Indians. And they said, you're not allowed to kill Indians for no reason at all anymore. And you cannot work them to death in your fields and your mines. So that but at that point, the Spaniards had basically raped anything that stood still long enough, and they had a very large mestizo population.
Well, let's hold on to that thought right there, and we'll come right back, because the story you're already telling intersects with some other popular movies which tell at least part of that story too. But I want to get to the full story of the lingering part of Mexican slavery too next on Coast to Coast AM. This is Ian Punnett. You know what we're talking about, at least in part here for this conversation with Bob Gleason, involves his new book. And it focuses, at least in part, on Mexican slavery. So we're talking about something which, perhaps it, perhaps you have some unique insight to this from personal experience in terms of your family history, or that's something that you've studied. But otherwise, when we talk about slavery in North America, it's pretty much focused on what the U.S. had done and its unique way of doing slavery. And Bob Gleason started this conversation by saying there was a differentiation between American slavery and Mexican slavery. And I want to get back to that, and we'll do it next. On Coast to Coast AM, this is Ian Punnett. Talking with Robert Gleason and the new book, Dead Men Don't Tell Lies. But Mexican slavery here being the core of the conversation, and we'll get back to a couple of the other threads of Bob Gleason's research I want to ask him about before we get to phones and bring you into the conversation too. But I want to pause that for just a second, and I want to say, part of how I reference what you're writing about was through the movie Apocalypto, the Mel Gibson movie, which I thought was excellent.
Movie. Yeah,
I thought
great movie.
It was, even though they compressed the timeline a little bit, and even though there were certain dramatic compromises that had to be made, I thought it was super effective. And it was I'm going to ruin the ending for people who've never seen it, but it was a very misinterpreted ending, where because of some, there was some hard feelings still about Mel Gibson. I think fairly well placed in many regard, but there were some things that Mel Gibson had done which had gotten him a less than favorable view from a lot of critics, and so they were very harsh about the ending of the arrival of the Spaniards to the shores after all of the events that take place in Apocalypto. And some people said, "Oh, this is Mel Gibson making a case for here comes the West to save the indigenous people from themselves, and this is his version of particularly Catholicism saves the world." And I didn't get that at all. Even the first time I saw it, and I thought, wait a second, that's actually really bad news. That they don't realize how bad the news is when those big red crosses on the sails show up on their shores. Yeah. And this is what you're getting at, is that it was all, in some ways, between the Aztecs and the Mayans, those were already brutal and sometimes violent societies, but it was nothing compared to about what was going to happen to them when the Spaniards got there.
Yeah, during the next 130 years after Cortez landed, that as I said, that there had been approximately 33 million indigenous peoples in Mexico, and there were fewer than a million left. And that is, you could imagine what the Mexican people were going through during that period. It was going through they had 130 years of Hiroshima, of the Gulag Archipelago, of the Holocaust. Right. They were and what that you talk about really prolonged lethal suffering. It was a great die-off. It was like a great extinction event. And that, the Mexican people today, part of what really forged the character of the Mexican people, and I admire them enormously, and I've known some of the finest people I've ever known in my life were Mexicans. I mentioned that in the afterwards, at the end of the book. And they have enormous stoicism, enormous fatalism, enormous courage beyond unimaginable courage. And I think a lot of that was forged during that period when 98% of the population died horrible, painful, agonizing deaths.
Yeah, it was a Holocaust of enormous proportions, and in a fairly, as you mentioned, a pretty quick period of time. And that has a way of imprinting on a nation's soul, just like our own slavery did, which is part of why Abraham Lincoln and others were trying to abolish it. They knew it was staining our soul as a country, and that we had to eradicate that. But as you already pointed out, there was this fissure within the Catholic Church, and some parts of the official Vatican philosophy was that slavery was okay because for whatever reason, fill in the blank, and other people were saying, no, this is wrong, and eventually the this is wrong people won out, but not until after tens of millions of people were eliminated from the face of the planet.
Yeah, the Mexican government in 1829 outlawed slavery, but that was a joke. That they put the wealthy people of Mexico appointed all the judges and hired all the police, and they were basically allowed to do anything they wanted.
And that's the interesting piece too, because I'll tell you a quick little thing. My wife's grandfather was a widower married a woman who, as it turns out, she was in the United States working at the hospital where he was a doctor, and she had a legacy, a family Mexican legacy, and she was of Spanish descent within Mexico. And so even my wife remembers going to visit her Mexican grandmother in Mexico City, and they would stay for quite a few weeks in the summer, and it was all built around the number of servants they had. The servants were usually very dark-skinned people. They weren't of the Spanish class, and that light-skinned European Mexican still ruled. And we're talking about into the 1970s. They still enjoyed a privileged place within Mexican society.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's your experience, too?
Yeah, well, it was funny that for most of Mexican history, that the Spaniards that ruled, the rulers of Spain, really looked down on the mestizo population, the mixed bloods. In many respects, they had it worse than the Indios Puros. And but now today, that Mexicans are proud of their Indian blood. You know, they really do see it and feel it as a badge of honor. But for most of Mexican history, that wasn't true.
Yeah, and there is that those gradations where the frequently the Spanish-related Cubans have sort of enjoy as I understand it, sort of the top of the Latin world food chain, and they sort of look down on Mexico and Puerto Rico, and they consider themselves, because of a closer association with Europe, they consider themselves sort of above everybody else, which gets a lot of pushback from Puerto Ricans and Mexicans who don't go along with that program, or if they did, they don't anymore. But let's compare that to slavery in the U.S., because when slavery was starting in the United States, they weren't using African slaves, and they were trying to use the enslaved Native American population or poor whites, which they were able to enslave in some pockets as well, but that never worked out. Can we address the difference between then too, the American style slavery and Mexican slavery?
Sure, but I just want to say one thing really quickly, really first, that Dead Men Don't Lie by Jackson Kane is not a nonfiction tome about slavery.
No.
It's actually a historical theory, a historical thriller that, among other things, features, I think, the greatest femme fatale in the history of literature. It's a woman known as a señorita. She owns half of Mexico. She's fantastically beautiful, fantastically wealthy, and unfortunately for her multitudinous lovers, she's sexually sadistic. And one of the main characters, he's an American, a young American traveling through Mexico. She's fallen in love with him, and that will not end well. She eventually turns on her lovers, and he will end up in slave labor mines, and his mother and outlaw Torrance Slater have to come down to Mexico to liberate him and save him. And, of course, they'll all get involved in the Mexican Revolution. So it's not... But slavery is a big part of it.
Right.
And the differences between American slavery and Mexican slavery are really quite profound and quite interesting. One of the small but extremely important differences is that the Diaz did not believe in breaking up slave families, and there was a reason for it. That he felt that if the husband father was there with his family, he would be less likely to attempt to escape. He would not want to abandon his family, and one of the effects, and Diaz had enslaved well over 50% of the population. And so these were people that the Mexican people came out of profound slavery, but one of the effects that had in not breaking up the families and keeping them together, that they developed a very profound sense of the nuclear family, and it was also a country. It was like Stalinist Russia, where everybody informed on everybody else. So the only people you could trust were your immediate family and extremely close friends, an extended family. So that the Mexican people developed enormous family loyalty and also enormous loyalty to their extended families. That our friend Lisa your producer was telling me that that she spends a lot of time in Guadalajara. She said they have no homeless problem in Guadalajara. If you have a friend or a relative, and they're living on the streets, you can't show your face in Guadalajara. You can't. The sense of extended family. And I've known some fabulous Mexican families in the United States. They have the same feeling here, and it's but that unlike American slavery, where they had no qualms at all about busting up families.
Yeah, it's based on that. It's based on.
For very mercenary reasons, they didn't break the families up. But the American slavery was really bad, but where it really turned bad was in around 1840. The English perfected the steam-driven spinning mill, and practically overnight, that they could sell unlimited quantities of cotton for a lot of money. And at one point, cotton became so valuable that and of course the American South, particularly the Deep South, had a global monopoly on cotton production, and so that the only thing standing between them and unlimited profits were they were having a sufficient number of slaves. So they began buying up every slave they could get their hands on. That's where the expression "sell them down the river" came from. Mm-hmm. If you were living in Missouri and you had some slaves, you could sell them for an enormous amount of money in Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, whatever.
Interesting.
And then the abuse of the slaves became horrendous.
Yeah.
The southern plantation owners had led an extremely profligate lifestyle. They were extremely ostentatious, always throwing lavish balls. That they were degenerate gamblers. That they were big horse races, big card games. They were betting everything they had. In the summers, that they're afraid of malaria, yellow fever, and what. So they'd take their families to New York City, and while they're in New York City, they would borrow money from the New York banks. And you know what they used for collateral? Slaves. They actually had on the mortgages. They had slaves down for collateralizing the loans. They would be borrowing money on next year's cotton crop, the year after next cotton crop. They'd be 3 years in the future they would be borrowing money. So they were just desperate for cash flow all the time. And so they really began working the slaves just hideously. And, of course, the things they feared most of all were slaves would run away. And that's when, the abolition movement in the North coincidentally started to grow, and the slaves did want to leave. They were being worked to death, and horribly, and beaten if they didn't make their quotas. And but also they feared slave rebellions, and so it really got very, very bad. And the slavery it was always bad, but it got really horrible in the Deep South for the slaves. But in Mexico, the difference was it was also fantastically bad. But one of the reasons was that at least slaves had some financial value in the United States. They had almost no value at all in Mexico. So the owners, and if the owners ran out of slaves, they were easy to get. They would just have, brokers go round up another 500, get local people, go into prisons, buy them out of prisons. They would have people. They would give workers bogus labor contracts. Most of them were illiterate, and so they could say anything at all, or they could just, Shanghai them, just hit them on the head and drag them off.
Drag them off.
And once you got into one of these slave labor mines or these slave labor haciendas, that you were incommunicado. Nobody would ever find you.
Right.
And so it was they really there were Yucatan slave plantations, slave haciendas, that harvested sugar, whatever, grew sugar, and the life expectancy was 8 months for a slave, and they would take if they were dead or dying, they'd take their remains out to the crocodile swamps and feed them to the crocodiles.
Oh God! And this is. Thank you. This is really interesting, and I can see how all of even just those little minute details help to build your fictional framework for the new book. Well, for any of your books, which you use these current events and or deep dive research into various topics to create your narratives. Going back to that thing about American slaves, and I always heard this was true, that the problem with the Native American population as slaves was it was pretty easy for them to disappear. They could if they broke free, that there were still tribes or places where they could go. They knew the woods. If they were white, they could get out and they could immediately blend back in, change their clothes, do whatever. And this is why they needed to have the distinct color difference of bringing in the African slaves, because this is what marked that color, was what distinctly marked the fact that this was very likely, if you came across them on a street, that they were an escaped slave.
Yeah, and they also, by the time they call when the slaves they have their point of origin, and then they go to where they're enslaved. That the journey is called the Middle Passage, and the Middle Passage was just horrendous for African slaves. And by the time they got to the half of them would die en route, and by the time they got to the plantations, they were dehydrated, starving to death, almost insane from the suffering they'd endured, and they were much more malleable. If you tried to enslave an Indian or a local, they were in good health, and they'd had a life of freedom, and they would not adjust to slavery very well.
Again, we're talking with Robert Gleason, Dead Men Don't Lie, an outlaw Torn Slater Western. I'm coming up at the top of the hour, so I don't want to get too deep into this, but I will ask you in the minute I have. I was sort of fascinated with the idea of what we don't hear about when it comes to the sort of slave myths. And in the United States, one of those myths was that, well, they were actually very happy, and they had homes and they had a roof over their head. And you'll hear people to this day make some argument about slavery wasn't that bad. And so I'm so glad you addressed that right away and say, no, it really, really, really sucked. There was nothing worse than that. But
the slave population in 1860 was so valuable. They were worth more than in aggregate. They were worth more than the steamship lines, worth more than the railroad lines. They were worth more than all the factories in the north. That they would, and when you figured that the work expectancy of a slave was probably 40 years, something like that, 30 years. That they were 100% responsible for the cotton profits. They did everything, and that there was no way the South was desperate to get work out of the slaves, and they had an attitude back then, and it was the same attitude that Diaz and the plutocrats down in Mexico had toward their workers, that they had nothing but contempt for them, and they thought the only way you get productive labor out of them is fear. You have to beat them and terrorize them. And even when you read biographies of Diaz from the late 19th century, they talk like that. And they say, like, the biographers will say, oh, poor Diaz, you got to feel so sorry for him. The people were so dumb, and the only way he could get productive labor out of them was to enslave them and beat them. No, poor Diaz. But it was a social Darwinistic attitude that they had.
Well, I'm going to hang on to that thought. We'll pick it up right there with social Darwinism and the other. So, Bob Gleason, as you were just talking before the top of the hour, a little bit more about the difference between the American brand of slavery and the Mexican brand of slavery. And even when the Civil War broke out in the United States, it was over, putatively under states' rights, right? That this was a states' rights issue, not about slavery. Well, it was states' right to have slavery so that they could maintain an agrarian economy that was an oligarchy and not a democracy, and it was a horrible abuse of human beings in the process. And there are people to this day who say, oh, no, nothing about slavery. It was all about states' rights. And this is what we had to, this is where I wonder, too, a little bit more about the Mexican slavery piece. What was their kind of defining moment in that regard? We were talking about that before the top of the hour in a couple of different ways. So I'll leave it up to you to pick it up the way you want to.
Yeah. As mentioned before in the previous hour, that the cotton in going up to 1860 it was the most valuable commodity in the world overall. The total value of cotton exceeded anything else. Steamship lines, all the factories in the United States, because the South had a monopoly on cotton. It was which meant that the slaves themselves were fantastically valuable. So the South was never going to give up slavery. You know, that they were, from their point of view, it was the goose that laid the golden egg. You know, they were never going to give it up, and it was Thucydides said 2,500 years ago. In the end, all wars are fought over money, and that was really what it was fought. The Civil War was fought over the incredible financial value of those slaves. Ironically, in Mexico, the slaves had, because they were just if they worked the slaves to death or beat them to death, they'd just go and have somebody go and a slave broker go and bring them in more slaves for a nominal sum. They were enslaving the population of Mexico. They weren't buying slaves from another country.
Which is easier to do, obviously, no transportation costs, etc.
He has enslaved at least 50% of the country. The Mexican
crazy.
People are Mexican intellectuals don't know what to do with Diaz. Suppose George Washington had enslaved 50% of the white population in the United States. Right. You know, that would be we wouldn't know how to talk about George Washington either. There's almost no good books written about Diaz because of that. He's just too embarrassing for the Mexican intellectuals.
So fascinating.
He was Mexican. It wasn't a Spaniard or a Frenchman who was exploiting Mexico, and he exploited that country much worse than the Spaniards or the French ever did. That, among other things, he had the Industrial Revolution. He had telegraphs. He had railroads. He had all kinds of advanced weaponry. He was just logistically, he was able to be more oppressive.
You know, this notion that we talked about in the war between the states here in the United States, as you say, it's all about money. But other than the moral problem of slavery, was there a financial incentive for the North to smash slavery? I mean, you could have made the argument based on what Diaz did that if they had just found a way to skim the profits, then they might have, let the slavery go on forever and ever. But they didn't, and literally, millions of people died over this war. So, what was the North's reason other than the offered moral imperative of ending slavery that inspired the government to act finally?
Well, you're right. In fact, that's almost a never-told story. That the fantastic sacrifice, the northern economy made enormous sums of money off slavery. We had our own. When the British in 1840 perfected the steam-driven spinning mill, some people stole the designs, came over here, and we replicated that. But the bankers, the factories, the shipping lines, the railroads, that cotton was simply the most valuable commodity in the United States. We had a monopoly on it. The North, during the Civil War, the northern industrialists and bankers and that lost a fortune, and the citizens from the North that were conscripted into the Union Army, they sacrificed enormously. I actually have a great Uncle Joe Gleason who fought with Sherman, and he on the march to Atlanta. He got a bullet fragment in his nose, and he carried it for 20 years. These people sacrificed in blood, and of course, it was the absolute. The South had become the North hadn't really wanted a civil war, and the South was so paranoid about losing this golden goose. The goose that laid the golden eggs, this cash cow. They had gotten so paranoid about their money that they declared war on the North, which was and just would not relent. And the Lincoln, those first few years of the war, he was always ready to cut a deal, and it really wasn't until that the Union Navy had cut off all the rivers, it had cut off all the ports. so the cotton crops were rotting in warehouses. The South was unable to sell any of its cotton. And one of the several reasons that Lincoln declared the Emancipation Proclamation was to keep the English from coming in and trying to get that cotton.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
And this also when we were talking about the Catholic Church involvement, and again, they were, at least in some respects, kind of in two minds. There were those within the church that insisted that this was wrong, morally wrong, that these were souls to be saved and people to be brought to Jesus. And this is the theme of the Robert De Niro, Jeremy Irons movie, The Mission, is sort of based on that, exactly on that fulcrum in history in South America. But this informs that other story about how the South had reached out to the Vatican and they were reaching out to various leaders in Europe to come save the South. And now I actually have a much better understanding of why that was. There was, you can have all this cotton, or you can have our white gold. You can come and take that if you come and save us. And then we'll make a deal just with you. And I thought, now I kind of get the desperation of those diplomatic moves.
Well, the irony is that the English who milled most of the cotton, that they went and they started planting cotton in Egypt and India, and they owned India. It was a colony of theirs, and they controlled most of Egypt, and they started growing. So by the time when the Civil War ended, the South no longer had their monopoly on cotton. And It was, ironically, they were so desperate to protect their investment, i.e. the slaves and cotton, that they ended up losing everything. The India and Egypt became big centers for producing cotton.
Well, that explains, of course, all the commercials for sheets and pillows made with Egyptian cotton.
Yeah.
That came out of that. But there were these weird... So how did that not happen in Mexico? What was why did the parallel events with slavery in the U.S. go one direction and they went different in Mexico?
Well, Mexico was a very impoverished country, and it had been one thing, and I don't like to say anything positive about Diaz, but one thing, because his methods were so barbaric.
Right.
But the Diaz did one thing. He stabilized Mexico, and previously nobody would loan Mexico any money, and so they had a hard time, building railroads, stringing telegraph wire, building any factories. I think nobody would loan them any money. It was they were always, it was always one revolution after another, one civil war after another. But Diaz, through horribly barbaric methods, pacified the country. And so he started getting money from most of it really from wealthy plutocrats in the United States, but also through Germany, other countries. And he did begin. They invested in the silver mines. They invested in railroads, and so there has been a tendency for historians to dwell on how many miles of railroad track that Diaz laid.
Yeah.
How many locomotives? How many thousands of miles of telegraph wire he's strung, and all these tremendous industrial and agricultural advances that he made. Of course, it was all done through slave labor. One of the things that Diaz would do in order to get this money from these wealthy Americans and Germans was, part of the deal was they would never have to pay any taxes in Mexico. He'd give them like 30-year leases, and he would also provide them with free slave labor.
Mm. But in unifying the country, that explains why he's sort of a Peter the Great-like character in the history of Mexico. That although also brutal, a unifier and somebody who established the original boundaries, perhaps of not just the country, but then the regions within the country, as he was sort of codifying Mexico into what we might know it today.
Well, yeah, and also that the historians, history is a polemic of power,
Right.
and the historians always want to write about who won this war, who lost that war, who was the most powerful leader of that period, and what kind of armies did this person have, that person. They don't spend that much time when you read histories of World War II. They don't spend that much time on the Holocaust. They don't spend that much time on the Gulag Archipelago, Stalin's Gulag. These are, they may have a few pages here and there, but most of it is they're talking about, power.
Right. We're talking here with Robert Gleason under the name Jackson Kane, has a new novel out, but it touches very profoundly on the history of Mexican slavery, something which most people, myself included, really don't understand the nuances of it all. But I know that in the U.S. there's an official end of slavery, and then in pockets all throughout the South, slavery continues just under slightly new forms, and it involves arresting people for the slightest offense and then making them work that off. But then, while they'll never be able to pay, they can pay the VIG, but they'll never be able to pay the original debt to society, so they end up staying as essentially slaves. And then we have the penal systems, which were horribly focused on enslaving people and getting them to do public works projects for, again, in some cases, the most minor of infractions. What were the ways that unofficially slavery continued in Mexico even after its official abolishment?
Well, they had the debt, it's called debt peonage, and it's
Right.
where it's kind of a sharecropper system that in the agriculture. We had the same thing in the United States. That black
Right.
sharecroppers, that they would the people that owned the land would create the illusion somehow that these people owed them money, and they were by law they weren't allowed to leave the farm until they paid off their debt. So they were essentially enslaved. And also they could sell you to another farmer. It really
in Mexico?
No, in the United States.
Right.
And they had something similar down in Mexico too, but they could and really this debt peonage, which we called the sharecropper system in the United States. You know when it finally ended? That in the late 40s, that the Alice Chalmers and the other they invented the mechanized cotton picker, and suddenly overnight, you didn't need people to pick cotton anymore, and that was the only way that this debt peonage, the sharecropper, the kind of sharecropper. We still have sharecroppers, but they're not essentially owned body and soul by the people that own the farms that they work.
I have some of that in my family history. That a very clear part of my family history in the South. My original ancestors came over in the early 18th century, and they were indentured servants. They had to pay off the passage to come here. But whereas and this is true within my family, it's verified, one ship landed in the wrong port, they disembarked, and so they were then put to work at a place, I can't remember if it was Maryland or Delaware or something like that, and then they had to work there. Then they got down to Virginia, and they had to pay off the original the debt that they had. So they ended up working 14 years in indentured servitude, and they couldn't get out of it.
That's terrible. My grandfather, my mother's father was he was an indentured copper miner for the Anaconda Copper Company in Butte, Montana. So we have something in common, Ian.
Yeah. So then, even though we know, it's funny because as we talk about this, perhaps people who've seen the movie In the Still of the Night knows that this is, arresting in this case, even a black Philadelphia detective standing on a platform waiting for a train for loitering. That loitering became like, if you were standing around for too long, you could be arrested. That was still a legacy of American slavery. That they would find a way to put people in these systems, and they would grind them under for years before they could get out. And perhaps, as you point out, in the mines of in Mexico, never heard from again. So, is there anything about the Mexican slavery system that you see manifested in, and I know this is I'm going to left field, but I'm curious, in the brutality of the Mexican drug wars and the cartels? Is there anything that you think comes as a result of that original DNA?
The thing that the Spaniards brought to Mexico and also to most of Latin America that was arguably, I'm not saying it was worse than slavery, but the effects were far more long-lasting and extremely pernicious. In order for, if you were a Spaniard and you wanted to come to the New World and you wanted to, make a lot of money, and you didn't want to spend more than a couple of years, 5 years maximum, in the New World, because you were afraid of malaria and yellow fever and the other diseases, the indigenous diseases. And so that you would come and you'd want to make as much money as possible. Among other things, you'd have to pay the King of Spain a lot of money in order to get your job. Say you're governor of Mexico or whatever. That these high-level jobs where you had the potential to make money, that you had to pay the king, and so you had to somehow pay off that investment. Now, the king didn't pay anything. That you came here and you exploited the population, and so you gouged anybody that wanted anything had to pay, and it went all the way down to the lowest officials who would kick money upstairs to higher up. It was
sure.
a system,
no doubt.
About the mordida. Getting back to the mordida, it was the most long-lasting affliction that the Spaniards really visited on any of their colonies in the New World was that it was a system of bribery that that people had to pay the King of Spain to get their positions. They would go down there because they were afraid of catching malaria and yellow fever. They did not want to stay forever. And they just wanted to go wring as much money as they could out of the population, and then go back to Spain and get a villa and live a life of ease for the rest of their lives. And they were absolutely ruthless in extorting money from people, and it's called the mordida. It's a system of bribery. And one thing, the Spaniards killed a lot of Mexicans. They enslaved them. They did a lot of bad things. But the one thing that they brought in that the Mexican people have had just hell's own time trying to get over is the mordida. And even today that cops will pull people over in Mexico City and just extort money from drivers for no reason at all. And it's one of that kind of, Russia has the same problem. They call it the blot. In the Mideast, they call it the bakshish. And once that kind of disease infects a country, it really holds the country back. It's brutal to try to overcome that. People don't trust each other.
And that, if I'm tying it back to the original question, this is then this is the legacy. This is the blueprint for the cartels and how they still operate to this day, and how it is really that this type of nefarious patronage worked in New York, for that matter. The mafia came in from the hills of Sicily, and they did the same sort of thing. And every ethnic group, it seemingly has its own mafia in that way. But it's the brutality of the Mexican cartels, that all of the beheadings and all of that, the things they've done to nuns and priests, and it just is so seemingly just so over the top in Mexico. And I don't want to say like you can't go to Mexico or whatever, but sure. Man, if you read just the headlines, it's a terrifying place to visit.
Well, the Spaniards brought with them the code of machismo, and it's to some extent, by pure coincidence, the slave owners in the United States, the plantation owners, had a similar code The Spartans, which had a huge slave society, there's nothing more macho than the Spartans. And but also when the Spaniards came over and they brought this, they respected and admired, skill with weapons, skill horsemanship. They raped women en masse when they came over here. They were the ultimate machos. And but when they did come over, the Mexican people, they had the Maya Aztec religion, and it was a religion. It was a death cult. It worshipped death. That when you went to the afterlife, if you were when you died, an Aztec or a Maya Indio, that the people, it was a horrible afterlife. There's like 9 levels, and if you made it to the 9th level, you got oblivion. You just disappeared, which was the only thing you could hope for. But in the afterlife, the two classes of people that were treated the best were the noble warriors and the suicides. If you killed yourself, you had the exact same status as a warrior. That they believed that life was inconsolable sorrow. It was a vale of tears, and the gods hated us and despised us, which is why they had to do all these blood offerings of human blood offerings to the gods to propitiate them. And that you're just better off dead. And this blended. It blended into the Spanish machismo in an odd kind of way, and it was the notion that you should never fear death. That death is your wisest advisor. Death is a gift, and that a real man would allow himself to be killed before he would dishonor himself. And it really is the Mexican machismo ends up. It's not like machismo that is as it's generally known in the United States. It's almost a love affair with death.
Right.
And you're right. I mean, you can see that most obviously in among the drug cartels. However, there is another side though to that, and the Mexican people have tremendous courage and perseverance, and that's the positive side of this. That they really. There's a fearlessness to them that you can see that the New York Times did a piece about these people coming up from southern Mexico, Guatemala, trying to make it to the United States and get across the border, and what they go through, the danger, the violence they go trying to make their way to the United States. These are young kids. They're tremendously courageous. I mean, they are willing to risk things that no young people in the United States would risk for anything.
It